Good morning and welcome to the 15th installment of the US Asia Institute's webinar series, Southeast Asia in Focus, titled Defense Pacts, the Future of Philippine Security Relations and with the United States and Japan. For those of you that have attended our webinars before, welcome back. And for those of you who are new to the US Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. My name is Jag Calvario and I'm a program assistant of USAI. For background, USAI is a nonpartisan, United Nations recognized nonprofit with a 44-year track record of building understanding and strengthening ties between the people and the governments of the United States and Asia. First, we would like to give special thanks to the USAI's corporate stakeholders for helping to make this program possible. They are SANS, AIG, ConocoPhillips, FedEx, Walmart, Philip Morris International, and Fairfield Maxwell. Now, moving on to today's program, President Biden's ironclad description of American defense commitment and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's visit to the Philippines come at a critical juncture with what is currently happening in the South China Sea. This virtual discussion will provide an overview and outlook of Philippine security relations with the United States and Japan. I would like to introduce our moderator for this webinar, Mr. Kevin Chen. He is an Associate Research Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies under its United States program, and he hosts an audio podcast called Engaging the Eagle, exploring U.S. foreign policy in Southeast Asia as part of his role at RSIS. He graduated with a Master of Science in International Relations from RSIS in 2021. He graduated with a high distinction from the University of Virginia, where he was awarded a BA in History, Distinguished Majors Program, and Foreign Affairs in 2017. Please feel free to send any questions that you may have for our speakers through the Q&A function, and we will dedicate the last segment of the webinar to answering them. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Kevin to begin today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, or should I say good evening if you're tuning in from Asia, like I am. My name is Kevin, and I'm an Associate Research Fellow at the U.S. program of the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. I have the honor of being the moderator for this webinar in the Southeast Asia in Focus series by the USAI, titled Defense Pacts, the Future of Philippine Security Relations with the United States and Japan. Thank you to USAI for putting this together. It was only in May 2023 that US President Joe Biden assured his Philippine counterpart Ferdinand Marcos Jr. that the US commitment to the defense of the Philippines is ironclad in response to China's increasing assertiveness in the disputed South China Sea. Since then, Manila has seen a series of firsts in its security ties with both Washington and Tokyo. For example, the first visit that President Marcos paid to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command Headquarters in Honolulu, the first joint patrols between the Philippines, the U.S., and Australia, the first batch of aid from the Japanese Program of Official Security Assistance, and as well as the what was looking to be an upcoming Reciprocal Access Agreement between the Philippines and Japan, Japan's first such agreement with a Southeast Asian country. However, China has also stepped up its own assertive efforts in the area. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been criticized for harassing boats carrying supplies to the Second Thomas Shoal, sometimes with water cannons. Just this past Sunday, the Philippine Coast Guard reported that more than 135 Chinese vessels were swarming at the Julian Philippe Reef. The Philippines has responded with a policy of assertive transparency, but much remains to be seen. How will the Philippines, the US, and Japan deal with these developments in the South China Sea? What lies ahead with joint patrols between the US and the Philippines, and with the Reciprocal Access Agreement with Japan? To answer these questions and more, the USAI has gathered Dr. Renato De Castro, Distinguished Folk Professor at De La Salle University, and Mr. Tetsuo Kotani, Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs, to discuss the topics with us today. Dr. Renato De Castro is a Distinguished Professor at the Department of International Studies of De La Salle University. He is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Albert Del Rosario Institute of Strategic and International Studies. He served as a consultant to former National Security Advisor Cesar Garcia Jr. during the administration of President Benigno Aquino III. In 2016, he was a U.S. ASEAN Fulbright Initiative researcher from the Philippines at the East-West Center in Washington. He was also an alumnus of the Daniel Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. In 2009, he became the U.S. State Department ASEAN Research Fellow from the Philippines and was based in the Political Science Department of Arizona State University. Mr. Tetsuo Kotani is a Senior Fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and a Professor at Meikai University. Mr. Kotani is a visiting fellow at the Center for Japan Studies at China Ocean University as well. He is a senior research fellow at the Research Institute for Peace and Security and part of the International Advisory Board for the Project 2049 Institute. In 2014, he was a visiting scholar for the Japan Chair of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Kotani won the 2004 Japanese Defense Minister Prize as well. Gentlemen, thank you too for joining us today. If I might start off this webinar, I'd like to ask Renato to discuss Philippine-US security relations and the trilateral security partnership. Renato, please.
Good evening, anyone who is in Asia like me, Kotani-san and Kevin. And for those who are in the East Coast, good morning, and I hope you're enjoying your winter weather here. Here in the Philippines and Singapore, it's still very much tropical. And here in the Philippines, something like 32 degrees Celsius. Okay, so let me do, I have a PowerPoint presentation. So let me set it up. So my presentation, and of course, my PowerPoint presentation is actually based on a commentary I wrote for a think tank in Singapore when I was asked, what's the prospect of a possible Philippine-US trilateral relationship. This was, of course, in the aftermath of President Bongbong Marcos' visit to Japan early this year. So I'll start with what happened and what's basically the implication of that visit. Of course, during the end of his 5-day official visit to Japan, which was, of course, his second official visit after, of course, visiting Beijing in January, President Marcos and, of course, Prime Minister Kishida discussed about the state of the bilateral relations between Japan and, of course, the Philippines. Not only discussing, of course, economic, which of course has become very intense, but more significantly, the security partnership, which of course has been there since June 2015. So what the two leaders has basically did was to reaffirm. More significantly, of course, they raised the prospect or the possibility of a proposed trilateral security relations between the United States, Japan, and of course the Philippines. So he admitted, of course, the idea of a trilateral security relations was discussed between him and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida during his visit. He has said, of course, the fostering alliances with its longtime partners and with longtime secure partners, and one of the many issues that was, of course, raised by the Philippine delegation while, of course, they were in Tokyo. He added such a pact would be a central element providing some sort of stability in the face of all these problems that are seen around us, adding also to help strengthen trilateral ties in confusing and dangerous situation, both Asia-Pacific region and beyond. Okay, let's look at the context. The wider context, of course, is that there is increasing tension in the region, not only triggered by, of course, the long protracted South China Sea dispute, but more significantly what happened last year. And of course, this is something that could be considered as the first crisis that the Marcos administration confronted was, of course, China's reaction during Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. And of course, during that visit, China was very angry. China conducted large-scale military exercises, of course, in the Pacific side of Taiwan, which of course was taken note by the newly installed administration. And of course, the other context is looking at domestically is the dramatic shift in Philippine foreign policy after 6 years of appeasement by the former Duterte administration. Suddenly, of course, you have a dramatic 180-degree turn, which we could discuss later. What accounts for this dramatic shift? Marked, of course, by efforts to, of course, challenge China's expansive maritime claim in the South China Sea, efforts to strengthen Philippine security relations with the United States, marked, of course, by the decision to increase the number of enhanced defense cooperation agreement from, of course, 5, the original 5 to 9, and of course, efforts by the Philippines to further enhance what I will call the security partnerships with other U.S. allies, Japan, Australia, and of course, South Korea. So we have to understand the wider context then. Okay, President Marcos, however, emphasized that the proposal for a trilateral security partnership among the three countries are still in the conceptual stage, as he noted that 3 countries do not have any details of this trilateral agreement. Okay, so So let's discuss, of course, the notion of what do you mean by a trilateral security network. So let me start, of course, from the fact that the idea is not you, the U.S. and the Philippines, since the countries have been cooperating, not only in terms of the fact that, since the 21st century, more significantly, we have to understand the Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty, the Japan-U.S. security relationship are, of course, linked. They're part of what we call the hubs and spoke system of alliances, or sometimes called the San Francisco system of bilateral alliances. More significantly, of course, if you go back into the histories of the Mutual Defense Treaty, 1951 Mutual Defense Treaty, and the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, of course, of relations of 1961, they're linked. During that time, of course, the Philippines, when the United States was about to give Japan its sovereignty back in the light of the Korean War in the 1950s, the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand asked for a guarantee against, a possible revival of Japanese militarism, just of course in case Japan is given back its sovereignty. On the other hand, the United States is very much interested in forging an alliance with both, with the three countries, Australia, the Philippines, and New Zealand, primarily of the concern of the fact that American occupation forces was depleted. They were sent, of course, across the East China Sea to to the Korean Peninsula, and there was a possible need. There was a concern among the American forces, American occupying forces in Japan, that there could be a communist insurrection in Japan. So Washington was looking at the possibility that Filipino, Australian, and New Zealand forces could be deployed in Japan just in case you have an uprising there. So that's the link then. You already have that existing link. Going back, of course, going into the 21st century, in some of my studies, I basically emphasize this. First fact that you have a major link happened during the time of the Arroyo administration, when the Philippines at the time became very friendly to China. This was the first time that the idea of a golden age of Philippine-China relation was raised in the immediate aftermath of the President Hu Jintao visit to Manila in 2005. Japan started to become very much concerned. I still remember the Minister of Defense of Japan making his first visit to Manila, saying the Philippines is an ally of the United States. Japan is an ally of the United States. Thus, of course, you have this link. Going, of course, into the aftermath of the Scarborough Shoal standoff, in the immediate aftermath, of course, the Philippines found itself in need of Coast Guard vessels. Japan, of course, entered the picture and offered to provide those Coast Guard vessels. And more significantly, something that had not been tackled during the 6 years of the Duterte administration, Japan made a pitch, personally to Duterte, not to drop the alliance. This was a very tense period in the alliance relationship. In October 2016, of course, when President Duterte visited Beijing earlier, before he went to Tokyo, he announced the separation from the United States, and of course joining Russia and China. I don't know if you remember that statement. A week, of course, later, he went to Tokyo, where, of course, the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe tried to convince him, you cannot just drop the alliance like that. So you have that important role played by Japan in ensuring that the U.S.-Philippine alliance stay intact, despite, of course, President Duterte's sharp rhetoric against the alliance during that time. Okay, so those are the two instances, or in fact, two instances in the 21st century where we already see this trilateral security relationship coming into shape. Of course, what happened more recently, China's maritime expansion, both in the East and South China Sea, its construction of artificial island bases, the militarization of those land features, and of course, continuing gray zone operation against both the Philippines and Japan had pushed these countries to strengthen their respective security ties with each other. And of course, we go back what is basically the significant role played by the United States in linking these separate alliances together. We begin, of course, with President Barack Obama's announcement of a strategic rebalancing. And of course, the United States actively supported increased bilateral relations among U.S. allies, most notably between Australia and Japan, Japan and the Philippines, and even, of course, the prospect of a trilateral cooperation among Japan, Australia, and of course, the United States, among others. These developments pushed Japan and the United States to focus on maritime security issues, more significantly in the South China Sea, including, of course, maritime capacity building, maritime domain awareness, joint training, exercise, and port calls in Southeast Asia, especially countries that, of course, are directly threatened by China's maritime expansion in the South China Sea, specifically, of course, Vietnam and the Philippines. So in recent years, of course, the US and Japan have accelerated the cooperation with a third regional partner, resulting in an informal trilateral network, or sometimes the term used by Professor Bilto of the Australian National University, minilaterals. So example of this informal trilateral minilateral networks include US-Japan, South Korea trilateral security dialogue. Of course, you have the US-Japan, Australia trilateral. And of course, you have the Japan-US efforts to boost Philippines' naval and maritime capabilities relative, of course, to the South China Sea dispute. So what basically triggered this? It's not simply the South China Sea. It's, of course, the prospect, the possibility that you'll have a major conflict that will happen just across north of the Luzon Strait. So, of course, you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which, of course, created the fear and the three capitals in Washington, D.C., in Canberra, and Manila. Even President Duterte was, of course, scared by this prospect that Russia's invasion of Ukraine would encourage and give China the model to follow suit in case of the Taiwan Strait. If Russia used force against Ukraine, then, of course, you have the possibility or prospect that China would use force to settle its irredentist issue vis-a-vis Taiwan. So across the Taiwan Strait, of course, China could mount an armed invasion of the island to retake what it seems or considered as a renegade province of China, similar to what President Putin did with, of course, invasion of Ukraine. Of course, from the perspective of President Xi Jinping and, of course, the Chinese Communist Party, they view it primarily as to end what they considered as the long civil war against the Kuomintang that began in 1927. And from their perspective, it's time, of course, to finally end the very long Chinese Civil War, but by either peacefully or forcefully incorporating Taiwan. So Washington, Tokyo, Manila became aware that the prospect of Beijing invasion and occupation of Taiwan would boost substantial boost to China's strategic position. And of course, it would enable the People's Liberation Army's Navy to impede the South China Sea, impede the United States fleet ability to conduct naval and air operation, not only in the first island chain, but also, of course, beyond the first island chain in the Philippine Sea. So they also become aware that China's control of Taiwan will enable it to base its grouping of fleet attack and ballistic submarine missiles in the island republic that will enable it to threaten Northeast and Southeast Asian shipping lanes as it strengthens Chinese naval presence in the first island chain with its sea-based nuclear forces. And of course, from the Philippines, this is a nightmare. The Philippines will be surrounded, of course, by Chinese naval power from three sides: in northern Luzon, and of course, in the whole of its western board in the West Philippine Sea and South China Sea. This led to the intensification of security cooperation among the three countries as the United States alliances with Japan and the Philippines provide critical access and serve as force multiplier. I'm quoting a study from Greg Pauling's work on the CSIS, and of course, a possibility of an armed conflict. So we see this in mid-2022, the prospect of heightened tension made imperative for Tokyo and Washington to align their possible defense planning for a possible crisis or worst-case scenario, a conflict across Taiwan. And here, of course, in the Philippines, early this year, President Marcos made a dramatic decision to offer the United States 4 additional enhanced defense cooperation agreement sites. And of course, 3 of those enhanced defense cooperation sites are located in northern Luzon. And of course, you have also dramatic increase of US, Philippine, and even Japanese and South Koreans and Australians conducting military exercises in the Philippines. I think for this year, there was about there were about 500 military exercises that had been planned and been conducted by the Armed Forces of the Philippines, Indo-PACON, and even, of course, the Japanese Self-Defense Force, and even, of course, the Royal Australian the Australian Defense Force. So all of this are happening, of course, in the Philippines. And of course, during his recent official visit to Japan, President Marcos and Prime Minister Kishida agreed to strengthen the two countries' security partnership through strategic reciprocal port calls, aircraft visit, transfer of more defense equipment, technology, continuous cooperation on previous transfer defense equipment, and capacity building. Of course, these issues have been further discussed when Prime Minister Kishida visited Manila. I think this was October. So let's look at the prospect. Would it be a formal tripartite security arrangement or something that is, of course, has been already ongoing, a trilateral security network? So the Russian invasion of Ukraine led Washington and Tokyo to plan for any possible armed contingency over Taiwan and, of course, strengthening the foundation of the security relations with the Philippines, creating, of course, the prospect of a Japan-US-Philippine tripartite security relationship. But, of course, this raises two issues. Number one, what will be the form of this trilateral security partnership? There's, of course, a possibility that you'll have a formation either of a formal, meaning, of course, the three countries would negotiate and sign a formal agreement that could take a form of either a security partnership or even a possibility of an alliance, which, I don't see it happening. The other one is in the case of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because there's already an ongoing, a de facto trilateral security network. So I don't know who would basically take the initiative, whether it will be Washington, Manila, or of course Tokyo, to transform this ongoing informal trilateral security network into a more formal security partnership. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to a very interesting and dynamic discussion.
Thank you, Renato, for the extensive insights into the trilateral security partnership and Philippine-US security relations. It's evident that the trilateral relationship didn't emerge from a vacuum, and you certainly gave us food for thought on whether the relationship will become a formal agreement or remain a de facto security network, as you mentioned. We can hold questions until the end, but for now, I'd like to hand the floor over to Kotani-san to discuss Philippines-Japan security relations and the trilateral security partnership as well. Kotani-san, please.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here to discuss the Japan-Philippine security cooperation as well as the trilateral security arrangements. So first of all, I think the Japan-Philippine cooperation is a kind of a natural development for the two countries because of the geography and also the shared values between the two countries. We now emphasize the importance of the democracy, freedom, and particularly the FOIP, free and open Indo-Pacific. But in addition, Japan and the Philippines are in some sense are frontline countries, which are facing the China's coercion along the First Island chain. So for example, in 2010, the China tried to take the Scarborough Shoal, and also the China tried to challenge the Japanese administration over the Senkaku Islands. And since then, both Japan and the Philippines tried to secure our territories from the China's coercion. And also we have a similar, the same challenge coming from massive disasters, such as the typhoons and massive flood. And in some cases, Japan and the Philippines cooperated on the disaster relief. So in that sense, I think we are natural partners to work on. And because of that, Japan and the Philippines have been working on the capacity building, particularly for the Coast Guard capabilities. And Japan has provided the Coast Guard cutters to the Philippines, and we have trained the Philippine Coast Guard people. And also, Japan has provided the air defense radar so that the Philippines could have a better picture in the vicinity of its country. And we have also try to expand our military cooperation, the joint training and exercises, and also Japan is now trying to provide official security assistance to the Philippines, and the Prime Minister Kishida just agreed with the President Marcos to provide the coastal radar system to the Philippine military. Previously, Japan has assisted the Philippine capability for law enforcement under the official development assistance. But this year, we have established the official security assistance so that we can directly assist the foreign militaries. And the Philippines is the first country to receive Japan's OSA. Japan and the Philippines are now negotiating on the Reciprocal Access Agreement. Previously, I thought we would discuss the Visiting Forces Agreement so that Japan's self-defense forces could visit the Philippines. But in fact, we are now discussing a Reciprocal Access Agreement. So not only the self-defense forces would visit the Philippine facilities in future, but at the same time, we expect the Philippine military would visit Japan for joint training and exercises so that we can further enhance our bilateral security cooperation. And I think it's very important to say that our bilateral relationship, bilateral security cooperation could develop regardless of who is in power, both in Tokyo and Manila. Even when even under the President Duterte, who had a difficult relationship with Washington, both Tokyo and Manila could develop security cooperation. So now let me turn to the trilateral aspect. Both Japan and the Philippines are US allies. So in that sense, again, Japan and the Philippines are natural security partners. But when it comes to Japan, Philippine, US trilateral security cooperation, it's not so easy to develop this trilateral framework, depending on who is in power in Manila. Under the President Duterte, because he had a difficult relationship with Washington, it was not realistic to expect to develop the trilateral security cooperation. So instead, as I said, Japan pursued the bilateral security cooperation. But under the current President Marcos, we have lots of opportunities to expand our trilateral security cooperation. President Marcos has agreed with President Biden to expand the EDUCA so that the US could increase their access to the Philippine facilities. And under this framework, there's lots of opportunities for US and Philippines to expand their security cooperation, not only for the South China Sea, but also Taiwan. Japan has been working on the defending, how Japan can contribute to the defense of Taiwan with the United States. And now that the Philippines looks more enthusiastic about contributing more to the defense of Taiwan. So I think the Taiwan issue could trigger the further trilateral security cooperation. And as I said, it heavily depends on who is in power in Manila. So as long as the President Marcos is in power, I think Japan would pursue security cooperation as much as possible. and further institutionalize the trilateral security cooperation. From Coast Guard to Coast Guard cooperation to military cooperation. And also we are now expanding our strategic talks, not only between Japan and the Philippines, but also among Japan, US, and the Philippines. And let me touch upon the two big challenges for the two countries and the three countries. First, on the South China Sea. The Japan, US, and the Philippines all stick to the rule of law, and we are trying to preserve the freedom of navigation, not only in the South China Sea, but also throughout the Pacific. And the United States supported the Philippines' efforts to bring China into the arbitration under the UNCLOS. And also Japan expressed strong support for this effort. And I think the three countries needs to further promote the importance of the peaceful resolution of the disputes. But more recently, China is now strengthening its disruption of Philippine military's activities in the second Thomas Shoal. And I think this issue has a potential to escalate into a military conflict, not between US and Philippines on one side and China on the other side. And I think the current situation in the second Thomas Shoal is very dangerous. And I think part of the reasons why China is now very aggressive is because of the President Marcos' decision to expand EDUCA. So in some sense, what China has been doing in the second Thomas Shoal is a punishment against the Philippines for expanding the security cooperation with the United States. So the US and the Philippines are already demonstrating their commitment to secure the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. And also they are trying to demonstrate their resolve to defend the second Thomas Shoal. But the challenge for Japan is how much we can contribute to the bilateral efforts to secure the second Thomas Shoal. Ideally, Japan could join the joint patrol by US and the Philippines in the second Thomas Shoal, and also Japan can provide more weapons to the Philippines so that the Philippines can defend itself. And now Japan has an official security assistance, so I think we will continue to provide more ISR capabilities to the Philippines so that they can secure the freedom of navigation there. But another challenge for Japan is whether or not Japan can provide lethal weapons to the Philippines. And in fact, the Japanese government is now discussing whether or not Japan should provide lethal weapons to the third countries so that we can contribute to the regional security. And at this moment, I cannot be 100% sure that Japan would be able to provide those lethal weapons. But I think the general sense here is we should provide even the lethal weapons to the security partners in the South China Sea. So hopefully next year, Japan would decide to provide those capabilities to the Philippines. And another big challenge for the trilateral security cooperation is Taiwan, as Renato mentioned. the Taiwan is, of course, a very politically sensitive issue for all of us. But given the urgency of the issue, I think there should be a more trilateral cooperation. And Japan regards the Taiwan contingency as a Japan contingency. So if there's a contingency in Taiwan, it would trigger the attack on Japan. So we are now preparing, and to monitor the PLA activities, we really need the Philippines' cooperation. And this is why we are providing a radar system to the Philippines. So not only providing radar system, we are expecting that we can share the intelligence with the Philippines, so that we can we can have a better picture of the PLA's activities surrounding Taiwan. And with regard to the Reciprocal Access Agreement, I think the primary objective of this is to further enhance our bilateral cooperation on the HADR, disaster relief humanitarian assistance. But from Japanese perspective, the Reciprocal Access Agreement could secure the dispersion of Japan's defense assets, because in the initial phase of a Taiwan contingency, we have to expect China would try to destroy all the Japanese bases by ballistic missiles. So our defense forces would lose the bases. But if the Philippines can provide the access to the Philippine bases and facilities for Japan's self-defense forces, we can secure our operational bases. So we very much hope the Philippines could agree on to provide our access to the Philippine bases in time of Taiwan contingency. And plus, another important aspect is the NEO, non-combatant evacuation operations. If there's a Taiwan contingency, we have to expect China would try to attack the Okinawa, and then we have to evacuate the civilians from Okinawa, not only to the Japan's main islands, but also to the neighboring countries. So hopefully Taiwan, in the Taiwan contingency, hopefully the Philippines would agree to accept the evacuation of Japanese civilians. So I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much, Kotani-san, for your presentation. As you rightly pointed out, several conditions make the Philippines and Japan natural security partners, but there are also challenges, such as the question of leadership in Manila, that can hinder further security cooperation. The discussion of the two big challenges that you mentioned at the end, facing the trilateral relationship, was also very enlightening, both in the sense of what has been completed and what challenges also remain. In that case, we will now begin our question and answer session for the panel. As John mentioned at the start, if you have any questions, please remember to use the chat box to send them in, and we'll do our best to address them. For the moment, I'd like to pose some initial questions to the two speakers. Renato, you mentioned just now during your presentation that you could talk a bit more about how ties between the US and the Philippines have actually warmed despite the initial chill during the years of the Duterte administration. Could you go a little bit more into that, please?
Well, I mentioned it, of course, the fact that during the initial part of the Duterte administration, there was clear efforts to appease China. This appeasement policy is, of course, characterized by, number one, agreeing to China's condition to manage the South China Sea dispute, going to negotiations, bilateral, conducting those annual bilateral consultations, which actually amounted to nothing, and talking, of course, about the prospect for a joint development. And of course, President Duterte also tried to distance the Philippines from the United States, and more significantly, of course, set aside the July 12, 2016 arbitral ruling. Eventually, of course, in the latter part of his term, he realized that he was not getting anything from China. So eventually, by around 2019, there was a realization, especially after, of course, he decided to abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement in February 2022, and you have an incident. He was shocked by suddenly you have an incident between a Chinese corvette and a Philippine frigate in the near the Reed Bank, which of course surprised him that despite his efforts to appease China, China continued conducting coercive operations, gray zone operations against the Philippine Navy and the Philippine Coast Guard. So eventually, my point here is that early on during the Duterte administration, there was already efforts to strengthen the alliance. Of course, during the time of President Marcos tried to maintain what I call a balanced policy, relying on China for economic goodies. Then, of course, something that he learned from the Duterte administration, you cannot simply drop the United States like a hot potato. If you drop the United States as a hot potato, China would consider you as a meat on the table. So this is something that he realized. So that was his initial announcement. China will have none of this. For China, if you become economically developed, dependent on China, you have to be sensitive to Chinese economic interests. So, what happened basically was, of course, you have continuing Chinese coercive actions. Kotani-san mentioned what's happening in Thomas Loma Shoal. Then basically he realized it. Basically, this is also my position. China pushed the Philippines closer to the United States. So that's basically the reason why the Marcos administration have taken what I would consider a hard balancing policy vis-a-vis China, marked by, of course, efforts to strengthen the armed forces of the Philippines and, of course, reaffirm our alliance with the United States and strengthen our security partnerships with Japan. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
I see. Thank you very much. We've got our first question that came in from the question and answer box. It's again directed to Renato, but I'll ask a question to Kotani-san after that as well. So to Renato again, you mentioned earlier that the formation of a formal alliance between the US, Japan, and the Philippines is not likely to happen. Why is that?
Well,
that's your question.
Yeah, okay. That's
sorry.
First, Kotani-san mentioned who would take the initiative, the leadership. Whether it'll be Japan, the Philippines, or of course the United States. So somebody had to take the initiative. Washington, Tokyo, or Manila. The next question, of course, it will have to go through a negotiation. You have 3 countries negotiating about it. The more challenging, of course, is I don't think in Washington there will be a need for a Senate concurrence. But in the case of the Philippines, of course, this will be very challenging. I think that will also be the case in Japan. So you have those, it's a matter really of legal hurdles that will be faced just in case if 3 countries decide to make this, I would call de facto trilateral relationship into a formal one.
I see. Thank you. Then to Kotani-san, I have a question based off your presentation just now. You mentioned that you were expecting there to be a visiting forces agreement, but before the news broke that there will become a reciprocal access agreement. Would you care to comment about why you think this this change was made, or how this came to be?
Well, so originally, I thought the Japan and the Philippines would discuss the visiting forces agreement so that the Japanese self-defense forces could visit the Philippines for bilateral training and exercises, particularly for HADR. But it turned out that 2 governments are now ready to negotiate reciprocal access agreement, so that both sides could visit each other for joint training and exercises, just like Japan has agreed with the reciprocal access agreement with the Australia and the UK. And I was wondering why we decided to discuss the bilateral I mean the two-way agreement rather than the one-way. And perhaps the one answer is so that the Japan can host the Philippine military for capacity building, not only for the HADR, but also war fighting. And by doing so, I think Japan and the Philippines try to demonstrate that we have a common interest in securing the first island chain. So with the United States, I think we are sending stronger signal to China that we are not accepting China's efforts to change the status quo.
I see. Thank you. Another question has just come in. This one is for Renato again. What are Philippine people thinking about President Marcos's foreign policy, particularly concerning the US?
Okay, first of all, you have to understand in terms of the constant. Now, historically, if you look at surveys conducted by two Philippine polling stations, the Social Weather stations and the Pulse Asia, and even if you check the annual survey conducted in Singapore by ISAIAS on the ASEAN, and even the one that was recently conducted, I was in Jakarta recently, when the foreign policy community of Dr. Dino Jalan came out with its annual survey, now funded by the Japanese. Always constant, the Filipino people consistently mistrust China. China is the most distrusted country. That's constant. Countries that are generally popular, of course, are the United States and, of course, Japan. So that's, of course, has been constant. Now, there are two elements here that, of course, generally affect the perception of the people. Number one, of course, is the president. So even during the time of President Duterte, his appeasement policy or the other, one way or the other also affected the public perception. It's the president. So there's a slight decrease in in terms of the net distrust rating towards China. Then, of course, the trust rating for the United States went down a little bit, but not that significant. But now, of course, you have a president that has, of course, been actively, explaining why we have to rely on our alliance. And, of course, the current program of the government of transparency, that all harassments of the Chinese conducted against the Philippine Coast Guard, Filipino fishermen, and Filipino naval units in the West Philippine Sea, South China Seas are, of course, openly broadcasted to the public. So this basically strengthened public opinion against, of course, China, and, of course, in support of the alliance. So if you have to look at the surveys, of course, there is a very powerful voice, a minority of Filipino analysts that, of course, are, of course, one way or the other supported by the Chinese embassy here in Manila. That, of course, have been accentuating, magnifying the Chinese narrative regarding the South China Sea. As a democracy, this is something that we could not simply prevent. So right now you have, what I could say, you have a very healthy, very dynamic discussion on what will be the direction of Philippine foreign policy way into the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you. If I might direct another question to Kotani-san then. I'd like to ask about the official security assistance program that the Japanese government just launched. I believe $13 million has been allotted to the program for the fiscal year through till March 2024. What do you think are the prospects of this program receiving more funding next year, during the next fiscal year?
Well, this is the first year, so in some sense, we are still in a trial. So we have started with the Philippines, and I think we will continue to work with other like-minded nations such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and in some cases in Djibouti in Africa. So naturally, I could assume the scale of the assistance will expand over the coming years. So we are still in a trial phase, And we have started with the Southeast Asian countries, but this is targeting to the Indo-Pacific. So I think over the next few years, we will try to expand the recipient countries throughout the Indo-Pacific.
I see. Thank you. Yes, it is. I agree. It is just the first year of this program, so we probably have quite a lot to look forward to, or at least hope for in the years to come. If I could direct another question at Renato, then I'd like to ask about the other kinds of cooperation that the U.S. is undertaking with regards to the Philippines, beyond just the security aspect of the relationship. There's also cooperation in the field of, for example, nuclear energy under the 123 agreement. What is the opinion of these activities outside of security activities on the ground in the Philippines? Is what the US is the US doing enough to cultivate the economic side of the relationship as well, or is it too heavily weighted towards security at this point?
Of course, there's active efforts on the part of Washington to have a balanced approach. You cannot just cooperate on security and ignore the field, more importantly, of economics. The United States, of course, is doing its part, but more significantly, the more important actor that the Philippines is looking at when it comes to economics, infrastructure development is Japan. So that's where, of course, Japan is filling in the gap in terms of, for example, the massive infrastructure projects that are being conducted there are, of course, funded by the Japanese. The commuter rail system from central Luzon down, of course, to the southern part of the Philippines is, of course, funded by the Japanese. The subway project in Manila is funded by Japan. And others will be funded, of course, by Japan and the Asian Development Bank. So any gap on the part of the United States in terms of the non-security aspect could be filled up by Tokyo, and now, of course, you have Seoul. South Korea is, of course, also jumping into the Indo-Pacific bandwagon, not only providing, of course, economic opportunities, but also in terms even of weapon system. South Korea is practically building up the capabilities of the Philippine Navy. So Japan is there, of course, so we're looking forward to getting some assistance from Japan, especially in terms of non-lethal. But South Korea, of course, is providing the lethal dimension in terms of building up the capabilities of the Philippine Navy. So again, the point is not simply looking at the United States, but more significantly looking at it in terms of a system of countries that, of course, adhere to the rules-based international order.
I see. Thank you. If I might, I'll turn back to Kotani-san with the next question then. I'd like to ask, we've heard from Renato about the domestic considerations over the relationship between the Philippines and the US, but in Japan itself, what are some of the domestic challenges that it faces when it comes to the strengthening of the strategic partnership between the Philippines and Japan?
Well, in Japan, there's no big disagreement among the political parties about the foreign policy directions, and particularly the partnership with the Philippines. So whoever takes power in Japan, I don't think there will be any big changes in the direction. But as I said in my initial presentation, now the Japanese government and the government parties are discussing whether or not Japan should change its arms export policy so that we can provide lethal weapons to the neighboring countries. And currently, we have a coalition in the government parties, and the one big party, LDP, Liberal Democratic Party, which is more positive on providing lethal weapons to the partner countries. But the coalition partner, Komeito, is more reluctant. So getting back to the question on the OSA, I think the scale of the assistance would expand over the next years, but we might continue to provide only non-lethal weapons to the foreign militaries, unless there's a consensus among the political parties about the importance of providing lethal weapons to the neighboring countries.
Understood. Thank you. In that case, I'd like to pose a question to both Renato and Kotani-san then. This has to do with China's gray zone operations and what efforts are already underway between the trilateral partnership between the US, Japan, and the Philippines. Is enough being done to try and address the challenge posed by the Chinese gray zone operations? Is this partnership going in the right direction, or do you have or do you believe that something better can be done?
Well, in terms of addressing the gray zone operation, that has been discussed between the Philippines and the United States when President Marcos visited Washington, D.C. In May this year. You have, of course, a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, where, of course, it was defined under what condition with the Article 4 of the treaty would take into effect. So whether basically what we considered as the red lines, what could be considered as gray zone, or what could be considered as what you call kinetic, where of course you have the actual use of force. Right now, you have a discussion here that the Philippine armed forces is slowly moving away from that gray zone paradigm. All the actions that are being conducted by the Chinese Coast Guard, by the Chinese maritime militias are, of course, orchestrated by the military commission. So it's really part of China's effort to effect what is now called the language that's being used here right now in Manila. It's kind of strong. It's Chinese maritime expansion. The Filipino term for this is pananakop, conquest. So there's no more distinction between what we considered as gray zone or armed conquest or expansion of the South China Sea. So in my short answer to you, it's the armed force of the Philippines is convincing the government to move away from the notion of gray zone. That gray zone will not remain forever. Sooner or later, it will be a case of you see Chinese, direct action that is aimed to effect its expansive claim in the South China Sea. Okay.
Well, so I think Japan can learn something from the Philippine effort to make China's gray zone activities more transparent. We are now able to watch what's really going on in the Second Thomas Show, because the Philippines are very much open to provide the images and the videos to the media. This is not the case in the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. Although the Japan Coast Guard provides the numbers, how many times the Chinese Coast Guard intruded into the territorial waters on its website, but Japan Coast Guard is still reluctant to provide images. But I think the Philippines' efforts to provide images is very effective way to appeal the international community. So perhaps Japan can learn from the Philippines' experience, and also reportedly, whenever the China disrupts the Philippine operation in the Second Thomas Shoal, the U.S. military deploys patrol aircraft or the drones above the sky, and I think this is also sending a very clear signal by the United States. I mean the U.S. commitment to the defense of the mutual defense, and again that is not the case in the East China Sea. Whenever China intrudes into the Japanese territorial waters, there's no U.S. military presence. So I think we can learn from this experience in the South China Sea. And another thing the Japan and the Philippines should consider is kind of a horizontal escalation. So whenever China tried to challenge the Japanese or Philippine administration of certain land features, we can challenge China's claims. For example, in Paracel Islands, or even the Taiwan Strait. I think we should respond more proactively to the China's gray zone activities.
I see. Thank you. I think, and with that, that brings us to the end of tonight's webinar. My thanks goes out to the USAI for organizing and hosting this event, and to our speakers, Dr. De Castro and Kotani-san, for sharing their valuable insights. Last but not least, thank you to our audience for joining us for this fascinating discussion. To our listeners in Asia, have a good night. And to everyone else, please enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you to Dr. De Castro, Mr. Kotani, and Mr. Chen for being with us for this webinar. We greatly appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to share your perspectives and findings about this important topic. Thank you to all those that have tuned into the webinar as well. Although we are out of time, if anyone in the audience would like to follow up with our speakers, please reach out to us and we will be happy to assist with fostering further dialogue on the things we have discussed today. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day. Thank you.